If you're a business owner, there's going to come a point where you need a stronger tech stack to have a clear picture of everything all in one place. From startup to enterprise, NetSuite is your one-stop solution. Visit netsuite.com/SPI to download their KPI checklist for free and support this podcast too. If you do find yourself buried in manual work or struggling to have a clear picture of your business, you should know 3 numbers: 37,000, 25, and 1. 37,000, that's the number of businesses which have been upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. 25, NetSuite turns 25 years old this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. And the number 1, because your business is one of a kind. So you can get a customized solution for all of your KPIs and one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need to grow, all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance absolutely free at netsuite.com/SPI. That's netsuite.com/SPI to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/SPI. There's a better way to create a website, a professional, crisp website you'll be proud to publish, and it just takes seconds. This is all thanks to Hostinger's AI website generator. I recently took this for a test drive, even shared this on my YouTube channel. It was mind-blowing. Not just how quick you can build a website, but with the AI, how great it actually can write copy for you. You can use the AI logo maker. Plus, it got it up in no time, and it looks good. Absolutely mind-blowing. So if you want to build a website, go to Hostinger, because they're a top, highly rated global web hosting platform. And all you have to do to build a website is just answer 3 questions and let the AI do all the work for you. You can build as many web pages as you need without knowing how to code a single line of anything. They have great support, too. That was one thing that I had a problem with another host back in the day. Hostinger has 24/7 support and a library of video guides. And here's the thing. You can do this for less than $3 a month, including a free domain name. That is crazy. So create a live website now at hostinger.com/SPI. And listeners of this podcast, you can enter SPI for 10% off your order and a free domain name. hostinger.com/SPI and use the code SPI for 10% off and a free domain name. Give it a spin. When I think back on my career, which is a 13-year entrepreneurial career, I'm not talking about the architecture career right before that, just my entrepreneurial career, I think about a lot of the pivotal moments that have happened across the way. I mean, immediate ones that come to mind are when Matt and I started working together. He's now my co-CEO, has been very influential on how the business has been going since, and I couldn't thank him enough, right? There have been people that I've connected with in my mastermind groups who have provided everything from the name of my books in certain brainstorming sessions to a shoulder to cry on at times. But when I think about some of the most important skills that I've learned to get here, one important skill is storytelling. And storytelling wasn't always something that I was very good at. In fact, I wasn't great at it at all. And it wasn't until I started, number one, posting content and learning about, well, stories engage, stories keep people on a page or on a video or, of course, on a podcast like this one. But it's a skill that can be learned. And when I started speaking, that's when I really honed in on that skill. And there's no other person I can thank for this than Mike Pacchione, who was my speaking coach back in 2012. I started speaking in 2011, got really hooked on it. And like everything I do, I go and find somebody who is an expert at it to help me get better faster, to help me minimize the amount of mistakes I'm going to make. Not remove them entirely because I need to make mistakes to grow, but to minimize them and also to guide me. And Mike Pacchione is our special guest today because we are going to the depths of storytelling. And we're going to tell lots of stories today and break down how stories should be told, because story is, like I said, what engages an audience. It's what brings emotion to the points that you're making. It is what helps transport a person from, I wonder if this is something I should keep watching or listening to or reading to, whoa, what happens next, right? This is what brings connection. And connection is key. And storytelling is the key holder or the key bearer. I don't know what the analogy is, but story is important. We're going to talk about it today with my former speaking coach, Mike Pacchione. Here we go.
Welcome to the Smart Passive Income Podcast, where it's all about working hard now so you can sit back and reap the benefits later. And now your host, He once broke his arm trying to impress a girl back in first grade. Pat Flynn.
Job searches can feel like they're taking forever, a real slog. So stop searching and just match with Indeed. So ditch the busy work, use Indeed for scheduling, screening, messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. If you want to hire fast, you need to go where the talent is. You can get unparalleled access to job seekers with over 350 million unique visitors globally, according to Indeed data, and an extended reach through Glassdoor. I love how adaptable Indeed is as well, whether you're hiring one person or you need lots for a scalable project, like hiring platform that lets you schedule and interview hundreds of candidates in one day. Like there's no other one that you would want to use. So join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/smartpassive. Just go to Indeed.com/smartpassive right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/smartpassive. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. We entrepreneurs are at our desks a lot, so having solid equipment is super important. And a sit-stand desk can make a huge difference, as many folks on our team will attest to. If you haven't tried one yet, this offer from Uplift is for you. Plus, you can support the show at the same time. Visit upliftdesk.com/SPI for 5% off your order. Over 1 million customers have chosen Uplift Desk. Innovative product designs, reasonable pricing, same-day shipping, free accessories with every desk. You can see why they're such a big hit. And did I mention the industry-leading 15-year warranty? And that covers the complete desk, by the way, not just the top or some fine print like that. Moving while you work is just healthier. And Uplift Desk provides a state-of-the-art experience. They're stable, made of very solid materials. There's over 100 desktop choices and customizations available. Just the choices for material for your desk are amazing, all the way from laminate to eco to bamboo to solid wood. If you want to build the workstation of your dreams, I highly recommend checking them out. Go to upliftdesk.com/SPI for 5% off your order. That's UPLIFT desk.com/SPI to get 5% off your entire order. What's up, everybody? Pat Flynn here, and welcome to session 519 of the Smart Passive Income Podcast. Whether you're a podcaster, a YouTuber, or you're writing, maybe books, maybe on a blog, even social media, you got to know how to tell a story. The better your story, the more likely it is you are to connect, the more likely it is those stories are to be shared, and here's the kicker, the more likely you are to be remembered. So here he is, Mike Pacchione, who is going to help us learn exactly how to do that. Mike from MikeTalks.co. Here he is. Mike, welcome to the Smart Passive Income Podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Pat, it is finally happening. I'm so excited, man.
I mean, a full episode for you, because you've been here once before in a little clip in an episode where we talked about what it was like to have a kid and be an entrepreneur, and you provided some really helpful insight on that. We'll link to it in the show notes. But here we are, full episode. Welcome. I'm really excited for today. And I have to also thank you publicly, because if people don't know this already, you helped me tremendously back in 2012, 2013, when I was learning how to speak on stage. You were my public speaking coach. So thank you for that. It changed my life.
Oh, man. Well, it changed my life too, Pat. And that's still one of my, what year was that? 2012, did you say?
Yeah, 2012, 2013, yeah.
I mean, that's still one of my very favorite projects. I don't remember why this happened, but I accidentally, because we used to record those calls, and I accidentally stumbled upon that recently. I was just listening to it.
One thing that you taught me was the importance of telling stories. And I've carried that over into my work on YouTube, into the podcast, of course. And I wanted to bring you on today to go deep into storytelling and how we can tell better stories and such. But before that, just real quick, how's the family doing? I know you have a kid and made some major life changes since you and I started working together. You used to work for Nancy Duarte, author of Resonant and Slidology, I think.
Yeah, Slidology.
She is amazing, and you've since branched off to do things on your own. How's that been?
Man, it is. I mean, there's a lot right now. I'm talking 5 days ago, moved from Portland, the Oregon version of Portland, to outside of Philadelphia. Or I guess we're moving to Philadelphia. My son is 2. He is so great right now. It's interesting. You and I started working together. I was single, wasn't even dating anybody. And, get to the other end of that. It's like I moved to Portland. I always tell people I moved to Portland in a sedan, having crammed in as many clothes as I could. And I had a big TV. TVs in 2005 were they had the big, they had a big back to them. That's all that I had. I moved back the other way. with a dog, a wife, a child, 2 of those giant pod things, and a giant SUV. But it's been great. My son is so great right now. I'm basically at the stage where I'm like, oh man, I just need to seize this. Like, don't let anything happen to him. He loves running. He's composing sentences. He loves taking baths. He loves basketball. Like, we watch basketball together. I'm a big Sixers fan. He can say some of the Sixers players. So you'd expect him to say like Joel Embiid. He's the MVP guy on the team. But one day I got my son up from the nap and he goes, Cork Maz. Like the 8th man on the team. That's how he woke up from the nap.
I love that. Dude, he's showing appreciation to those who don't often get appreciated. And then you'll get him into the Iverson era and some of the history, I'm sure, and down the road. I'm so glad to hear things are well with the kid and your wife and things with the move. I mean, a lot of things happen all the time for everybody, but it's been a crazy time for sure this past year. And we need to catch up. Just you and I need to get together and catch up so we can save the rest of this part of the conversation for later. But I do want to talk about storytelling. Why is storytelling so important?
I guess my short answer to that, I think storytelling is the most portable way of communicating a point. If you think about it, think of a great story that you once heard. You've had so many on your podcast. Like I just, when I went to FlynnCon, the one that stood out to me that you've referenced several times on your podcast is Shane Sams telling the lawnmower story.
It literally has a name. It's like the lawnmower story.
Right. The lawnmower story. Right. The power of that, because it's such a good story, and he does almost everything that I train people to do with storytelling. Because it's such a good story, other people are able to tell that story for him. He doesn't call me every day, say like, hey, Mike, can you tell my lawnmower story for me? But I'm able to do that because it's so clear. There's a clear point to it. I can picture the whole thing happening. That's the essence of story. If you do it well, it can be passed on from person to person to person. I mean, honestly, if you think about a world pre-iPhone, pre-iPad, pre-laptop, pre-computer, pre-typewriter, pre-pencil and paper, pre-quill and ink, it's like, where did our history come from? It's from story, like person A telling a story to person B. It's a lot easier to understand story than it would be to just understand random points.
That story is so great. The lawnmower story, for those of you who might not remember episode 122 of the Smart Passive Income podcast with Shane and Jocelyn, he was telling his story about when he first discovered the Smart Passive Income podcast. And he was sitting in a lawnmower, turned on SPI, and then stopped mid-mow to run to his wife, Jocelyn, and go, this is how we're going to change our lives. And she's like, you're crazy. You're bat crazy right now. And so you could kind of imagine that happening. Of course, he told it with more eloquence, with more detail. I do want to talk about how to provide those kinds of visuals within the spoken word in a minute. The beauty of that is it was the origin of like when he discovered the podcast. And I think a lot of people struggle with, well, I don't have a good story to tell. I didn't have a life-changing moment to tell a story about that was like that. Or, a lot of entrepreneurs especially tell stories that are about, the time they got into a car accident and their life flashed before their eyes. And that's a very, oh my gosh moment. How do we tell stories when we don't have an oh my gosh moment? Can we even?
The key is you actually do, but I know that exact feeling. I used to think that motivational speakers were all people who lost a limb to a shark or something like that, right? It's easy to feel like, oh, I don't have anything. But your story is simply, okay, so here's the way I explain story to people. There are 3 acts to it. This is true whether the story is 30 seconds long or it's a 2-hour long movie. There are three parts to it. So there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. The beginning and the end are actually what you figured out first. So the beginning, who you are at the beginning, the end, who you are now. There should be some level of transformation. If there's no transformation, there's a problem with that. So you need to figure out what the transformation is from beginning to end. But by nature of anything, there would be a transformation. Sometimes the transformation is, I was a normal guy. I was a math teacher, science teacher, history, whatever Shane taught. Sometimes it's just where you were and where you are now. That's what it always is. And I think what's important to remember, because it's really easy to get, I guess I would call it origin story jealousy, right? It's really easy to be, oh man, I never got fired, right? I never slept on my sister's couch. I just was successful on the side. But your starting point is going to be a common starting point for someone out there. And I think that's important to remember.
I'm remembering a story that I once told on stage that I was just going to tell because it was something interesting that happened and it had a little bit of a lesson to it. But I didn't realize that in the way that I structured it, it in fact was a 3-part story. It in fact had transformation and it literally had people laughing and crying at the end. And I just was so surprised by that. I think perhaps that came from practice of telling other stories and just kind of now I'm in automation mode with a lot of this stuff after having done it for years. It was a story about, and I may have told this at FlynnCon, but it was a story about my son wanting to play the iPad in the car on our way to lunch, where I was like, no, you can't. But maybe you can if you can convince me why. And then we go through this little sort of back and forth. And, I try to, play role of Pacchione when I'm telling the story of like, please, like, I just want to play Minecraft and how he first started telling why he wanted to play it, but then transformed to why that would benefit me, the parent. And the punchline was he said that, well, if you let me play Minecraft, I can become a better architect and I can teach you how to be a better architect too. Like that had people rolling and applauding. I was like, wow, that's actually really cool. I'm going to tell the story over and over again because that's the other thing that I learned. I learned this from Ramit Sethi. He said, you got to build a story bank, like stories that are crazy origin, like Marvel Universe type stories to little moments like that during the day when your son wants to play the iPad in the car. They can all become things that could be a part of a bank that you could pull from later. And that's been one of the most useful things. So to combine the art of storytelling, which you've taught me, with the just collection of stories that happen, I write things down at the end of every day, just little things that were different that made me think. Those could potentially be then extracted into something that could really make an impact online. The lesson in that story with Pacchione was know who your audience is, basically.
And what you just said there, that I guess you're saying what Ramita said, which most things Ramit says are pretty good. The more that you have stories in your back pocket, it's the best because what appears to the audience like, wow, Pat really thinks on his feet was just like Pat had this story in his head from 3 months ago that his computer brain just said, let's dial this up and we're going to pull it out. And I've told the story a bunch of times and I'm totally comfortable with it. I know when you're going to laugh, boom, win.
Yeah. Oh man, I've at dinner parties, like I've used the stories that I've told on stage because it just, like you said, oh, there's the story that I have that fits in this moment. Let me tell it. And then I tell it and everybody, they're like, wow, you're like the life of the party. And I'm like an introvert. I just happen to have practiced those things. And it feels a little bit not manipulative, just like calculated, which feels weird in a conversation that is supposed to be organic, but honestly, it's been like really cool.
Well, and a lot of people have resistance for that exact reason that you're saying, because it feels to them manipulative is the wrong word, but I know what you're saying. It feels to them like it's not organic, maybe is the right way of saying that. We're trying to entertain the audience. If we're speaking on stage or we're having a video, presumably you want to get your point across. So you want to sell your idea, your product, your course, whatever. A story will help that point land. Like on a really basic level, Pat has an idea in his head that he wants to get out into the mind of his audience. If telling a story of his son doing that helps that point land, that's gold. And that's what you should do.
Yeah, people remember the stories. They, like you said earlier, can tell the stories to others versus if I just go, hey, if you want to share a message, like just know who your audience is. Okay, like 50,000 other people teaching entrepreneurship say the exact same thing. Here's my way of making it unique in the way that also is very quote unquote Pat Flynn like with bringing the family in and poking fun at myself and those kinds of things. And then over time, there are certain moments that, and I'd love to talk about this too. It's like the ethics of storytelling, meaning, so that story was true, but there were things in that story when I eventually told it over and over again that I added on to make it even more of a hit, right? Like there was a moment in the story which honestly didn't happen. I'm just going to tell all of you, it didn't happen, but it made the story that much more funny. And maybe that was the wrong thing to do. I'm not like telling lies, but I'm kind of, right? Like, so the part in the story that I added in just for fun to see what would happen, and I kept it in ever since, was a part like after 3 or 4 back and forths between me and Pacchione, I eventually get down on one knee and I go to him and I look him in the eye. I'm holding my iPad and I said, I want you to sell me this iPad. And he goes, you want me to sell you your own iPad back to you? And then I just get frustrated, right? Like that moment didn't happen, but it kind of sums up how I felt in that moment of just like, you're not getting it right now. Like you're not, the words that I'm saying are not getting through to you. What are your thoughts on things like that?
Are you asking me if I believe in lying?
That's it. Remember, this is recorded for your kids to listen to. This is recorded for your family.
Dad, remember back in 2021 when you said this? Click.
That's why I didn't come home last night.
In all seriousness, one of the tips that I've given people, so this is specific to the ending, but it really would work where you are too. Okay, so you need to make the story emotionally beneficial to the audience. That's what you're doing with that part. Now, one of my favorite stories I've ever heard was a pastor named Andy Stanley. He tells a story about being a little kid and they had a pet snake. And for some reason, the pet snake gets out. It gets out into the house. And he's like, yeah, we looked for him for 15 minutes and then we couldn't find him. So we all went to bed. And you hear these gasps from the audience. They're like, what? He's like, no, we didn't do that. Of course we kept looking for him. The lie, I don't know if you call it a lie, but the temporary lie is to give the audience the emotional satisfaction that they want in a story. So you have to decide for yourself how you want to edit that part. But to me, what you should do in a story is you should give the audience an emotional benefit. And the way that you do it, what you might, if you felt bad about that, like the thing to do would be to say, I didn't do this, but here's what I was thinking to myself. Because it would probably accomplish the same goal.
Or do the thing and then go, well, that didn't actually happen, but that's how I was feeling, right? It's like your pastor friend said. Okay, that makes sense. So if anybody's ever heard that story, I'm sorry. Everything else is true, though. Everything else.
It's an interesting question. So a lot of the stuff that I teach comes from memoir writing, which I've never published a memoir, but I've written that extensively. There's a whole debate in the memoir community about editing for memoir, right? Because what some authors will do just for clarity of reading is they will like fuse multiple characters together just so there are less characters in the book. And then other people feel like that's not accurate. So to me, that's a decision you have to make for yourself.
The fish I caught was this big, right? It's like, I mean, that's the classic line of stories and how they get re-embellished and then turned around. Like it was just a minnow, but now it's a shark, right? After so many people tell it. Anyway, what are some things that people online, especially, are doing incorrectly when it comes to storytelling? This way we can maybe avoid some of these things.
I've got basically 7 things that I tell people to do. Now, you don't have to do all 7 of these, but let me just go through these somewhat quickly and you can ask questions along the way. Do you like how I'm taking control of your podcast? Yes. So I'll do this.
This is exactly what I want. I can just go take a bathroom break and you can still just keep going.
I always tell people the very first thing you need to do is to plan the resolution or lesson to the story. What most people do is they assume that the audience will get why you're telling the story. And sometimes it's so obvious that it would be almost insulting to the audience to declare the lesson learned. But most of the time, you should actually say, here's why I'm telling you this, or here's what I learned from that.
No, that's really good. In fact, if I told this iPad story and I didn't have the lesson, it would require more calories for people to just understand it, which would then either tire them out, like literal calories being used to figure out, well, what's the point of this? And maybe some of them get it, maybe some of them don't. Or I can make their life easier and just go, here's what all that really means. And now it's the lesson wrapped in the story that can get retold, that gets remembered, etc., and brings emotion to it. That's the other part of the story.
Totally. And what's cool about that is a good story can go in a bunch of different directions. Because the same story that you're telling is know your audience. That could also be, because you could tell that same story and the lesson could be, I bring this up because my son felt like, what did he have to lose? I may as well take my shot. So that's one of the things I love about good stories is, I want to be careful about the way I say this, but so I picture this. I always have an Excel file. Column 1, name of story. Column 2, approximate length. Column 3, purpose. And a lot of stories can have more than one entry in that purpose column, just like the one that you just told. So, but I always tell people you have to figure out why you're telling the story. You can't just tell a story just because, oh, it's funny. I heard people like stories. Sure, but it's more effective if you declare out loud what the resolution or lesson is.
Love it. So the mistake would be just telling the story without any real point or purpose or end goal or end lesson.
Yeah, totally. Next one is to prime the audience. This one feels very obvious, but plenty of stories fall apart, or plenty of people don't do this. Okay, so picture you're at a cocktail party talking to like someone not very interesting. You want to get away from this conversation. And then they say, let me tell you a story. It's like you perk up, your posture gets a little bit better. We are excited by stories. You hear them say something like, I heard a great story about that. Oh my gosh, I have a great story about that. What you're doing is you're priming the audience to enjoy it. What most people do is they jump right into it. Now, picture this, especially if you're doing something online, YouTube video, you are very likely one of several tabs that are open. And same thing, if the audience here is, I've got a story, or let me tell you a story, it's like, oh, let me go back to that tab. Let me stop emailing. Let me go back to that tab. So I know that feels really obvious to most people, but that helps tremendously. It lets the audience know they're about to hear something good.
I've experimented a few times on YouTube videos and on podcasts, starting out by saying, hey, let me tell you a quick story before I even get into what's the purpose of this episode or who our special guest is. And I've noticed that retention rates are in fact higher, because what I feel happens is people go, ooh, story time, right? Like you said, versus like, is this going to be even worth my time or not? The story, hopefully with a good ending or a good reasoning behind it, will then lead to, okay, I'm committed to this, right? And plus what you're doing online is part of the storytelling. Obviously, you got to be decent at telling a story. You can't just tell a story for 20 minutes and expect people to stick around if it's not great or worthwhile. Let's say, for example, you tell a 30-second, 45-second story at the beginning of a podcast that relates to why they should stick around. Well, now they've committed a whole minute to the podcast that would then lead them to stick around, or probably put that phone in their pocket or go on that drive. And now they're no longer able to or likely to exit. So I love that idea, and priming the audience. Like, imagine we're at that cocktail party again and you're with somebody not so interesting, and they go, it was a dark and stormy night. You're just going there. And now I think you're more weird because I'm not even interested.
That's an amazing thing to picture. It's just someone, they can tell you they're losing Pat. He wants to go get another drink, and they just, hold on. It was a dark and stormy night.
Right. Or even not the hold on, just like going right into it, right? I think it was Kevin Hart who had spoken about storytelling once when I was doing a lot of research on storytelling. And if you watch Kevin Hart, whenever he's on stage, and especially when he's in a group, he tells some, like, comedians especially tell amazing stories. He always says he's got to get the attention of people around him first before he tells his story. Actually, he told this on Joe Rogan. He said that whenever he's in a group of people and he's going to tell his story, he goes, hey, guys, listen up, listen. Like, step one, get people's attention, right? And that's priming them, getting ready. He goes, guys, this Tuesday, this incredible thing happened with my car. It's like, yo, what happened to your car? And now they're in, right? So I love that tip. That's a really good tip.
That's so good. And then along with that, so the next tip is to create tension. This is really what story is all about. So if you were to take a screenwriting class, and you certainly don't have to, but if you were to take a screenwriting class, one of the things you would be taught is that in a film, every single scene should either create tension or release it. Create tension or release it. That makes sense. So what tension feels like to the audience is them thinking, wait, what happens next? What happens next? What happens next? Now, it's certainly possible to string it out for too long, and a lot of people do that. Generally speaking, you want stories to be a minute or less. We want to create tension, and some ways of doing that, one way is to use the present tense instead of past. If you use the present tense, it's a way of tricking the audience into feeling like you are in that moment and watching it. It's interesting. I was listening to that Shane Sams story today. Shane, you didn't know you were going to get this much play today. The exciting parts of his story, he dips into the present tense. What that does for the audience is it makes them feel like, oh my gosh, what happens next? What happens next? What happens next?
Instead of saying, oh, I told Jocelyn that this was going to be the life-changing podcast for us, versus, Jocelyn, this podcast is going to help us become millionaires.
I run inside. I say, Jocelyn. So if it's present tense, it feels that way. There's tension in there. And then we need to release the tension. And the best way to communicate that is, I'm going to use the word, the release is the punchline. Now, to be clear, not every story needs to be funny, but the punchline is the payoff for the audience. The most popular TED Talk is Sir Ken Robinson. It's like 70 million views or something.
On education, right?
Right. And the first half of that TED Talk is basically him telling stories. He's so good at it. And if you take a look, and I've studied this extensively, but I'll just tell you one of the stories. I've heard it so many times. He's like, I heard a great story recently. I love telling it. It's about a girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6. She was in the back drawing. She hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. By the way, it has a British accent, so it sounds better than me, right? But in this drawing lesson, she did. The teacher was fascinated. She went over and says, what are you drawing? And the girl says, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher says, but nobody knows what God looks like. And now here's going to be the release of the tension. And the girl says, they will in a minute. So the release is the punchline. Tension release is a big thing. So present tense is great for that. Asking questions of the audience. You might say something like, now you might be wondering what that means, or you might be wondering why that matters. Another thing you can do is to give them insight into your own brain. I remember thinking to myself, what's he going to say now? Something like that builds tension. And then we would need to release the tension.
It's almost like there's some classic movies that start out that way. Some like crazy scenario. You're like, what the heck is going on? Pause. Hey, I'm Ryan. You might be wondering, how did I get into this situation, right? Or Ratatouille, right? That happens in the beginning of Ratatouille also.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's Fight Club. That's my favorite movie.
Oh, yeah, you're right. You're right.
At the beginning, he's like, how this all started was...
And then 2 hours later, you're like, oh, okay. Dude, I got to send you that video to the Kevin Hart interview, because that story he tells at that time, he tells a story about a fan who wanted his autograph, but he was at a restaurant and he was going to the bathroom. He's like, yeah, like just chill out here, wait up. I'll be in the bathroom. I'll come out. I'll sign your autograph. He's like, cool. So he goes and he's in the stall and he notices between like the cracks in the stalls, like this boy comes into the bathroom, is like waiting for him where the sinks are. And he's like, dude, I just told this guy to stay. What is he doing in there? Is he going to murder me? Like, what's going to happen? And that's like the tension part, right? And you're just like, how could you leave that story? You have to stay till the end for that.
Yeah. Not interested. Turning this off. Yeah. It's so good. It's so good. So that right there is an example of my absolute favorite tip, which is we need to put the audience in the scene. So they need to feel like they're in the scene. Another way of saying this is we want to be more like country music than rock music. So let me break apart what I mean by that. Okay, so like, listen, I love rock and roll. I love country. I'm not telling you to listen to one over the other, but like every rock and roll song is like, why won't you ever love me? And we hurt each other and we'll do it again, right? Like those are rock and roll lyrics. Those are really abstract. And country music is concrete. Country music paints a scene. It's like this is Kenny Chesney. This is not my favorite country song, but I'm just saying it tells a story. He's like, me and my lady had our first big fight. I drove around till I see the neon lights of a corner bar and it just seemed so right. So I pulled up, not a soul around, but the old bar keep down at the end, looking half asleep. Like you were picturing this whole thing happening. Your audience is more likely to be bought in if we paint a picture of the scene versus just speaking abstractly. The lawnmower story works because it takes place on a lawnmower. It's not just, I listened to Pat's podcast. It's, I was on the lawnmower and I pause and I run inside, right? Like that's how it feels. Amy Porterfield, if you hear her origin story, one of the things she talks about is she gets a phone call while she's on the tarmac. So she's like walking on the tarmac, wheelie bag in one hand, phone in the other, getting screamed at. You can picture that whole thing. That makes us feel like we're there. Ultimately, that's the power of story, is we're dropping the audience into a scene from our life. And the more that we can add little detail, the more credible the story is, the more the audience is bought in. And that almost automatically adds tension.
Thank you for that. That's a great one. And how do we do that? Is it like if I'm going to the grocery store, I park my car, the rubber on the wheel felt greasy to my hands. I opened the door and the squeak sounded louder than ever before, like...
Right. Because there's such a thing as overdoing that. And we can all probably think of a bad storyteller in your life I'm just thinking of someone who remained unnamed, and she would tell stories and she would say things. She would just add every last detail. It's like, and I met up with him and he was drinking a lemonade and I had on Argyle socks that day. And as an audience member, you're like storing those little details in your head. Okay, Argyle socks is going to matter. Argyle socks is going to matter. It never matters. The key is that we just need to add one or two vivid details from the key part of the story.
Perfect. That's what I was looking for. Like, how many things do we describe? So when you tell the story of Amy Porterfield with the suitcase, she's obviously going somewhere. It's in her hand. We can imagine it, and then something happens and her life changes, right? So the lawnmower, that's a vehicle that was basically representing doing the work and grinding and getting it done, and then boom, here comes a podcast that interrupts that in a way, almost symbolically.
And we don't need to know that Amy was sitting in seat 7A. Like that's too much. That doesn't matter. We just need to know that she
in 7B was somebody else, right? And then the numbers matter.
Right. Exactly. Or if 7 was her anniversary and she's missing her husband, something like that maybe matters. Something like that. Yeah. Just to give a little bit of the science on that, if you read the book Made to Stick, they do this great study. So they do this great study. This is like a mock trial study done in college. And you know how these things work. A/B testing, basically. Group A, they say the children went to bed and they brushed their teeth. Group B, the children went to bed and they brushed their teeth using Darth Vader toothbrushes. And it's like the people who bought story B with the Darth Vader toothbrush, the results are through the roof. Like that little detail sticks out to us.
That's true. Yeah.
I could overdo that, but that's my favorite thing. Beware of overdoing it, but just one or two vivid details at the key point is what you're looking for.
How do we, before we move on to the next tip, I'm just curious. I know from my own experience that I need to practice telling these stories, and I need to tell them in ways that are terrible in order to eventually tell them in a way that can hopefully be great. What are your favorite ways to practice storytelling?
I can always tell someone has not rehearsed a story because here's how it'll sound. It'll say, I was doing a podcast interview with Pat, and I hooked up my microphone, and so I realized the microphone wasn't working well. So there's a lot of there are no periods on the end of sentences.
This is a true story, by the way, y'all.
There's no periods on the end of sentences. There's a lot of there's a lot of and so. What we actually want to do, and this is going to sound staged, but I promise this was my next tip, is err on the side of shorter. So it's almost like the shorter you can make it, the better. That the most popular Sarah Ken Robinson story in that talk is 24 seconds long. It's 24 seconds. That's it. Unless it's a truly incredible story, like it should be a minute or less. And what you want to do is run it through a bunch of people. I would try to talk in 7 to 10 word sentences. And I mean, if you wrote it out, it should be like 200 words.
Would you recommend writing out a story and like essentially your script for it?
I would recommend writing it out, but not feeling like you have to have it memorized. There is something to
only I knew that when you and I started working together. Do you remember?
It's like the very first thing I said. I was like, well, what do you do now? You're like, well, I write out the entire 60-minute talk. I memorize the entire thing. And I walk in. I forget what your walk-in strategy was, but it was like 3 points on the stage. I'm like, what? Like, why are you doing that?
Because I don't know. Yeah, I used to write every single word.
And because you're Pat Flynn and you're still an achiever, but you've gotten more efficient with your way of achieving. That's the reason why.
I appreciate that. So write it down so you can just like see it and move it around or deal with it. Or I love Post-it notes. Actually, this is how I prepare my stories now. I use Post-it notes, and I have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Essentially, and then I have one Post-it note per idea, moment, or quote, or story, or something, and then I move things around, and I might remove some, I might add some. Now I'm at a point where I'm confident enough where if I have experienced something, I can just tell it, and I'll practice with real people before I write it down. And I might eventually get to a point where I write it down before a big stage talk. But like you said, I never go exactly according to what I write down. In fact, oftentimes, it goes in ways that I don't even know it was going to go because I'm just having fun on stage at that point.
And also, okay, let me give a more like concrete answer to your question about how you can rehearse it better. One would be to rehearse with someone, hear how many times they say, uh-huh. If they say, uh-huh, more than once, this story is too long. So that's one thing you can do. If you're telling me a story, I'm like, uh-huh, like that story's gone too long. Another thing you can do is rehearse with, I don't mean literally me, but rehearse with me or someone else and have them tell the story back to you and see what they actually remember. Because those are probably the good parts. And that's really a good thing for any speech, but especially for a story, that's helpful.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Talking it out loud by yourself, is that considered good practice?
Yeah, the more you do it, the more you'll realize, oh, I don't need this part. Most of us, this is similar to what Laura Belgray says about copywriting. Laura in copywriting says you can almost always delete the first paragraph. Like start writing the email and then go back. Oh, I don't need the first paragraph. That's almost always going to be true with the first draft of your story, because your temptation will be, this takes place at 6th grade. I was in school in Connecticut. It was December, and you go back and you hear the story like, oh, nobody needs to know that stuff. But what's really happening there is you're recalling the details for yourself, and that's the same reason why the bad storyteller is telling you, I was wearing Argyle socks that day and I was drinking lemonade. It's because in the moment, she's remembering those things and it's kind of fun. It doesn't actually help the person hearing the story. So there you go. Err on the side of shorter we just spent a lot of time on that, ironically, to say err on the side of shorter.
That's good.
So the next one is totally optional, but if you do it well, it can really add a lot to the story, which is if there's a character other than yourself in the story, if you can describe that character in a sentence, that is gold. So you're telling a story, right? Because if I'm telling a story about you and the audience doesn't know you, they don't need to know. And Pat lives in San Diego and his birthday's in December, and he has 2 kids, and he's happily like, they don't need to know all that stuff. They just need to know the part of you that is essential to the story. Truthfully, I have said this about Pat Flynn before. When someone asked what's Pat like, I'm like, Pat's the type of guy that you give him homework and he does the homework. Right. So if I'm telling a story, like I need to mention whatever helps the story. Now, if you were really in one of my stories, that needs to either inform who you are or it needs to be used ironically. Right. So it's like Pat's the type of guy who does the homework, but for some reason today he didn't do it. And now look what happened. That's the way it needs to be used. So some other ones that my friend Sarah, I always describe her as the type of woman who eats quinoa as her cheat meal. So it's like the point is instantly you know that person. You don't need a whole background and she went to college here and da da da. Grant Baldwin, I think Grant. I describe Grant in a story. I'm like, Grant's the type of person who shows up at Disney World and he's got a plan. He knows exactly what rides they're going to go on. You know that person immediately, and it helps the story.
That's very true about Grant. Love you, Grant. That's good. So is this is the type of man, this is the type of woman, he's the type of kid. Is this like a good sort of just formality or structure for it?
Yeah, totally. Right. This is the type of guy who blank. This is the type of woman who blank. Here's a hint. Pat and I both love the Enneagram. So some people, this sounds like Indiana Jones or something when you talk about the Enneagram, and we could do a whole separate podcast on that. But if you know the Enneagram and you know the person's Enneagram number, you can basically just drop one of those traits into describing them. Does that make sense? So it's like no, let's not talk about my wife. Let's rewind.
I was thinking about going down that direction too, but I should. No, my wife, April, many of you know of her or have met her perhaps at FlynnCon. She is an Enneagram 6 who is a loyalist. She's the type of person who's only going to have a few number of friends. She's not going to be caught in a large group, but she will take a bullet for any of them.
Perfect. Yes, that's perfect. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Steve is the type of guy who will fly to the Maldives tomorrow because it sounds fun. That's an Enneagram 7 if you know Enneagram. But even if you don't, it's a fun writing activity anyway, but it helps the story because the audience instantly feels like they know that person.
The quinoa one was great. I love how you said that. That's good. I need to do more of that. I've never done that before in a story. I gotta do more of that.
It's fun. Well, and even in the Sir Ken Robinson one, he talks about, he's like, the little girl hardly ever paid attention, but in this lesson she did. So she hardly ever paid attention. You can picture that person. This is not the A student. This is the girl in the back of the room. Probably didn't do really well, but in this lesson she does. It helps inform the story.
I like it. These are all really good. Yeah, let's finish off.
Last thing is to obsess about the ending. So many people, whether it's on stage, video, whatever, run out of gas at the end. And the ending to a lot. Okay, so let me say this differently. What we're trying to avoid in a story is the ending like, well, I guess you had to be there. And then we got away. Right? Like that's
like, I'd rather not even hear the story because I've invested this time and it's like,
if I had to be there, I didn't need to hear the story. Pat, I feel like The Sixth Sense is like the all-time best ending. At least the first time you watch it, it's like the all-time best ending to a movie. If you rewatch it, it's not like that great of a movie, but the ending is like, oh my gosh. Now, I'm not saying that we can always have this ending that, has people pushing themselves away from the table and covering their mouths in shock, right? Like that's not always possible. But the ending to a speech, the ending to a story, the ending to a video, we want the audience feeling this emotional high. So a lot of times what we need to do is to actually change the order of the story or to end it before the experience ended in real life. So let me give you an example. There was one guy that I coached. He wanted to tell a story about playing basketball with Adam Sandler. That's how he started the story. I live in Santa Monica, and one day I went down to the court and Adam Sandler was there and he was my teammate. So he's telling the story and it's like, but the best part is 4 seconds in and the rest of it is just hearing about Adam Sandler's basketball ability, which is not.
I've seen him play basketball. He wears basketball shorts. He's the type of guy.
Oh, good one.
Adam Sandler is the type of guy to wear to play basketball in 2XL basketball shorts with a polo shirt.
Oh, let's make this story even better. I didn't have that one. So here's the way I actually told him to say it. I'm like, okay, Nate, it needs to be, I live in Santa Monica, went down with a friend to play basketball. After a while, there are these two guys who are sitting out on the side. They're like, can we play? And finally we said yes. So It's a pickup game. We pair the tallest guy with the shortest. So Nate's 6'5". You see him on stage. I'm obviously the tallest guy, and they put me with the shortest guy. So I introduce myself. I'm like, I'm Nate. And he says, Nate, it's nice to meet you. Doesn't say his name. So the game starts. Nate's posting up. He's the tallest guy. His teammate's good enough, but and let's insert Pat Flynn's edition here. But he's like the type of guy who's wearing 2 XXX shorts. Like he can dribble through his legs and everything, but he's also like acting a little goofy. He says, I can't even call for the ball because I don't know the guy's name. Then after a few possessions, I'm like on defense and I'm sitting there, I'm thinking about it. I'm like, why isn't this guy telling me his name? And I look over at him guarding my buddy and I realized why he never introduced himself. It's Adam Sandler. Like, do you hear how that's a better story?
That's so good. The cool thing actually was saved to the end in that case. That's really good. And there was some detail in there. Guys sitting on the bench, a little bit of picking team, a little bit of this type of guy is not very great, posting up. I'm there with you, like you said earlier. Like, imagine that I'm there with you. And I'm imagining me looking over to this guy guarding my partner and then looking and going, oh my gosh, like that's Adam Sandler. Like that's Billy Madison, Happy Gilmore. and then that's the end. It's just like, and that's Adam Sandler.
Yes. Yeah. That's Adam Sandler. I forget what the lesson is in that story.
Okay, the lesson. Yeah, that's what's needed. The lesson is celebrities don't want you to know that they're celebrities because they feel like paparazzi's on them all the time and they just want to be regular people.
Sometimes there's value in anonymity, or sometimes the best thing we can do is to not get in someone else's business. It's a little bit of a stretch, but the actual point of the story is just to tell at a cocktail party and to have people excited. But it's better if it ends with, it was Adam Sandler versus, he didn't pass enough. Like, okay. Well.
That's true. No, that's good. So whether we tell these stories in videos or on a podcast or in person or on a big stage in front of a crowd, like all these tips that you mentioned are so great. And like you said, you don't have to use all of them, but any one of them can enhance the message and the ultimate lesson. And that's the one thing I think entrepreneurs are great at. We know the lessons, what we want to teach, and we just kind of go right to it right away. And we just blend in with everybody else who's going to it right away. And these stories from your life and from wherever, I mean, the final question I want to ask you is, where do you get your inspiration for stories, and where might people look to find these stories that are around them to include in their content?
Everybody I have ever worked with has reached a point in a speech or a podcast or whatever they're working on where they're nervous that they're telling people things they already know. That is why we often speak over our audience's head. The dumbest feeling for us would be to explain, you need to think about your audience when they already know that. One of the reasons why story is so effective is because it's impossible to tell a story that's beneath your audience. If it was really basic, I guess maybe you could. But story is a different way of expressing the same point, and it hits people on a deeper level. So it's one of the reasons why it's so valuable to do. I recommend, like you said, a memory bank or a story bank, story vault, whatever terminology you want to use there. I literally have a Google file. I have a Google Sheets file that, just like Pat said, I just jot things down. Sometimes it's a micro story. By micro story, I mean something that doesn't need to have this lengthy exposition. It's just 2 or 3 sentences. Sometimes it's something longer, but it's like when someone tells a great story, there are certain people in my life that my one friend, Chris, is a park ranger in Denali. And every year he has one insane story. And I'm always like, Chris, let me record this one. I'm not saying you have to be that weird about it, but writing them down. One of the things you can do, a great place to start is thinking about childhood. So think about first grade, like go to first grade, spend 2 minutes thinking about the people who are in your class in first grade, second grade, third grade, fifth grade. I don't know why I skipped fourth, fifth grade, all the way through middle school. Middle school is really good because a lot of those stories are really painful, and painful stories are great to recover from. So if we think of a story as transformation from beginning to end, that's a really good starting point. How awkward you were in sixth grade. I had braces 3 times. I had the biggest file in my orthodontist office, right? Like, so I wasn't that cool is what I'm saying, right? So that can be a really good starting point. So thinking about your life as one long timeline, that's really good. It can also be helpful to think of important people in your life and stories that happened with them. So it's like, drop yourself into college. And I'm thinking of my college roommates like Chris and Josh and Peyton. And I think of Peyton and a few stories jump to mind. And again, I don't need to write out the whole story, just a few words that remind me of the story. So it's like the Jethro Tull story. I know what that is. I don't need to write out the whole thing. Honestly, spending an initial half hour on that would take you so far. and then just jotting those stories down. Pat said at the end of the day, whenever it's coming to mind, that's great. I read magazines, which I know is kind of outdated, but I get physical magazines. One of the reasons why is because they have great stories in there. And the magazines I read are not read by that many of my peers. So I'm 43, but I think I'm in the like age 65 target market. Like I get Reader's Digest, and like the ads for that are really funny. So I get like Reader's Digest, Alaska Magazine, because these are not things that most people are reading. And that adds a degree of surprise to the stories that I read there. You didn't know that about me, did you? Yeah, watch
No, I
Wheel
didn't.
of Fortune too. Yeah.
And now every time I look at a Reader's Digest, I'm going to think of you.
Yeah. When does that happen though? That's the question.
I don't know if that's kind of bad. Bro, this has been absolutely incredible. Thank you. This has been a nice refresher for me as we are starting to get back into the speaking circuit, as I'm getting into YouTube a lot more now, and of course, continuing with the podcast and such. I hope this was helpful for everybody listening. Mike, where can people go to connect with you? How might they be able to work with you? Where should they go? I
help people give the best speech of their life, at least the best speech to that point in their life. And as such, my site, bestspeech.co. Welcome Sequence is 6 great. It's just 6 great stories to get you started off. So you'll get that in your email. Also host the Best Speech podcast. I think for this audience, Pat, here's a big surprise for you. If you go to bestspeech.co/Pat, I'm going to deconstruct a Pat Flynn story. So I know. So why it works, Pat is, I mean, he's so good at theatrical is the wrong word, but one of the things I love about you as a speaker is you are not fearful of doing things that feel a little bit risky. So we'll deconstruct what works so well. If there's anything that maybe, oh, we could have done this or this or this, but we'll deconstruct that. So again, that's bestspeech.co/Pat. When someone's like, I heard you on Pat Flynn, or I heard you work with Pat Flynn, I get excited. In that moment, I'm instantly thinking to myself, oh, this is going to be a good person. So I know you're always Team Flynn for the win. But that is more than just you, my friend. I love working with the SPI tribe.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. Everybody go check out Mike. One more time, link, and where can they go get that deconstructed Pat Flynn talk?
Yep. So bestspeech.co and bestspeech.co/Pat.
Thank you. And for everybody out there who has seen your name but doesn't know how to say it, can you just debunk exactly how it's pronounced right now for all of us?
It's Michael Giancarlo Pacchione. So Mike Pacchione, Pacchione, if you actually want to sound Italian, that's the true pronunciation, but we've turned it into Pacchione. Mike Pacchione.
There you go, everybody. So now you don't have to worry. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate you. And Mike, you're awesome. Thanks so much for coming on.
Much love, Pat.
Whew. All right. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Mike. Mike is always such a pleasure to speak to. I always learn something when I'm speaking with him. And even if we're just having normal conversations on the phone or anything like that, I'm always trying to decipher, okay, how is he going to tell me this story? What's the structure of this? How is he going to bring the punchline? And he always does, and it always impresses me. And it just takes practice, right? It takes practice. Mike, thank you so much. If you want to check out what Mike has to offer you, go to bestspeech.co/Pat. Again, that's bestspeech.co/Pat. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope this helps, and I hope you use some of these strategies maybe even later today at the dinner table or at work or perhaps on the next phone call with a friend. Give it a shot. Try it. And of course, in your content as well. Thank you so much. Make sure you subscribe. We got some more stories to tell you. We got some more content coming your way and some amazing guests, of course. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next episode. And until then, peace out. Take care. And as always, Team Flynn for the win. Thanks for listening to the Smart Passive Income Podcast at smartpassiveincome.com. I'm your host, Pat Flynn. Our senior producer is Sarah Jane Hess. Our series producer is David Grabowski. And our executive producer is Matt Gartland. Sound editing by Duncan Brown. The Smart Passive Income Podcast is a production of SPI Media. We'll catch you in the next session. Hey, if you're looking for a new podcast to add to your rotation, I've got one for you. It's called Dirty Money, and it's like a hybrid between a true crime and a business podcast. So hosts Jonathan Small and Dan Bova tell the tales of legendary scammers, con artists, and barely legal lowlifes who stop at nothing to rake in millions. Recent episodes include a man who looted $100 million from his own company. Crazy. Give it a listen. Head on over to Dirty Money right now on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or Stitcher.